This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course, lecture number 13, on the characteristics of the book of Luke.
Well, welcome back. This is our second in the series of lectures on the book of Luke. So far we've done kind of a historical background on who Luke was, his relationship to Paul. We noticed that he was not Jewish and that he was picked up probably at Troas on the second missionary journey of the Apostle Paul, which is kind of like northwest Turkey, and then goes over to Philippi, state of Philippi, and then on the third missionary journey, Paul picks him up, brings him back to Israel, where he probably did a lot of research while Paul was in prison for a couple of years at Caesarea Philippi, captured in Jerusalem. And then we said Luke probably interviewed Mary, other people like that. He was a physician, and Paul calls him beloved physician, and also then goes to Rome on the shipwreck in Acts 27 to Rome. So Luke is kind of a historical, he writes in a historical way. We said, we looked at carefully Luke 1:1-4, which Luke says that he's aware of many other accounts. So we know Luke knew of other accounts, and he uses them, and he says, particularly he talks about the eyewitnesses. And apparently he interviewed eyewitnesses. We suggested at that time Mary was probably one of them, just because Luke seems to tell Mary's story, and you pick up the voice of Mary. We now are jumping into the characteristics of the book of Luke, and we had talked about his emphasis on the Holy Spirit. Now, Luke writes Luke and Acts, but this in this book he also talks about the Holy Spirit. And in the book of Luke, the Holy Spirit comes on various people, as we saw last time. And so we saw John the Baptist has the Holy Spirit coming on him, Zacharias, John the Baptist's father, Mary, the Spirit comes on her, Simeon, and Jesus himself, the Holy Spirit. Acts chapter 2 is probably the most famous passage of Pentecost. Acts chapter 2, when the Spirit comes down and they speak in tongues, and the apostles are basically receive the Holy Spirit at that time after Jesus ascended into heaven, about 40 and then 50 days Pentecost after that. So Acts chapter 2 is Luke again, and Acts chapter 2 is famous for its expression of the Holy Spirit. Now, today what we want to do is kind of finish up these characteristics, and I'm kind of working through this acrostic H, C, D, S, S, P, P, P kind of thing, so you can just kind of organize it kind of like that. And we'll go through some of these things. The book of Luke picks up on the humanity of Christ. And this is an important thing for us as Christians. You've got this divide going on where secular kind of people of other religions, they love Jesus as a good prophet. Everybody loves Jesus, the lovey-dovey Jesus, forgive your enemies, 70 times 7, forgive, love, kindness, love your neighbor as yourself, that kind of thing. They love the lovey-dovey Jesus, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek kind of thing. So everybody loves Jesus, the human prophet. But as soon as you say Jesus is God, then all of a sudden you've got major problems with Islam and other religions and things like that Jesus Christ is God in flesh. That's hard for people. And when people love Jesus as a good prophet, but they cannot take him as being God. And even liberal critics oftentimes will focus on the humanity of Christ and say that the later church turned him into a God. And that's was in the early part of the 20th century. People were saying that kind of thing, and even till this day. So we as Christians have often emphasized the deity of Christ. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Logos, the Jesus, was with God, and the Word was God. And we've got a ton of other places we go to that Jesus Christ for his divinity, to show his divinity. Now here, what Luke is doing is Luke picks up on Jesus' humanity. And I think this is a very important thing for us as Christians to think about Jesus being a human being. Sometimes I'm afraid we make him we deify him so much when we think about his divinity that we lack thoughts about his humanity. And so here's Luke, and here's what Luke says. This is a famous verse that Luke says. And Jesus grew in wisdom. Jesus grew in wisdom. In other words, he didn't have it all together. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature. Now we can understand when Jesus was born, he was born as a baby. He wasn't born as a 6-foot man. He grew in stature, but he also grew in wisdom. And we need to try to understand that, and in favor with God and with men. And so I just want to think about this growing in wisdom, this kind of thing. I think that's important for us as Christians to think about. When Jesus was born as a baby, when he came out from his mother's womb and was circumcised on the 8th day, did he know how to speak Hebrew already? You say, well, he's God in flesh. Well, yeah, but he's also human. And so this is kind of an important thing here. Did Jesus have to learn to speak Hebrew, Aramaic, probably, and Greek? Okay, my guess is he was probably trilingual at least, and those were the languages that were used. So he had to learn those languages. And then this raises another question too. If Jesus learned these languages, then Jesus would have to learn scriptures, just like anybody else would. Now, granted, he's got a special mind. His mind is maintained by sin and things like that. But still, Jesus, when he was born at 1 year old, did not know the scriptures and had to learn them, be taught them, and learn to read. He would have to learn to read. He would have to learn to speak. So, and then another question comes up. So Jesus would have to learn to read, to speak, and things like that. He would have to learn the scriptures himself. But what about his self-understanding? When did Jesus understand, come into knowing that he was the Messiah? And did his understanding of his own Messiahship, did that grow over time? In other words, when he was first born, at 1 year old, he probably wasn't thinking about his deity and his incarnation, his Messiahship, and that he was going to die on a cross. He was 1 year old. And so how did he come into that self-understanding of who he was? And I think that that's a pretty important thing to think about, okay? So you want to think about Jesus in terms of his own self-development of his thinking and his humanity. He was a human being. Jesus was a child. He was a Jewish child and grew and things like that. So I think thinking about the humanity of Christ is a pretty important thing. So Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. And what I'm saying is sometimes we jump in and we assume at 30 years old, or however Jesus was, 30, 32 years old, when he comes on the scene in Galilee, we give him all this, he has all this tremendous understanding and things. But we realize that he, as a child, would have had to come into knowing what it was that he was to do as the Messiah. So something important to think about, I believe.